mind. It's kind of more really about bootstrapping the predictive brain, but you'll see by the end why there's a kind of hacking element to it. I should thank quite a few people, but I won't waste too much time doing that, but there they are. In particular for this, Carl. Okay, what I'm going to do is start off by supposing that pretty well everything that I believe is true. Seems to me like it's a good place to start. Let's just assume that what I believe is right. Let's assume that our brains are fundamentally organs of embodied prediction, and that action and perception are both flowing from that same deep source. So give me that, and then the question will be, how should we think about higher cognition? How should we think about language, art, technology, and culture? What's it doing in that kind of nexus? So that's the kind of idea. All I'm going to do in this rather short session is put 3 ideas on the table and then stop. The first idea, the most fundamental, and the one I'll spend longest on, is that temporally deep active inference kind of merges epistemic and pragmatic concerns. This may be familiar, but it is this kind of fundamental point here, so I'm going to elaborate it a bit. The idea is that PP, active inference agents, select epistemic actions on exactly the same basis as they select practical ones. So I think a lot of people in this group will know about epistemic action already. It goes all the way back to Kirsch and Maglio in the 1990s. They pointed out the existence of this whole class of actions whose role seems to be to improve our state of information rather than to directly advance us towards a practical goal. So head bobbing in chickens is thought to improve depth perception. So that would be to improve your state of information. It's not necessarily getting you nearer to the food. So is turning on the light when you enter the room. Another example would be if you find yourself in a new city and you find yourself wanting to find your way back to the hotel. Very often, a lot of human beings would navigate to a spot that they know already the route to the hotel from. So you go back to somewhere where you know your way to the hotel from there, and then you navigate the route. You might do that, even if that takes you temporarily a little bit further from the hotel. So now your practical goal and your epistemic goal are temporarily pulling you in opposite directions. So there's something called the coastal navigation algorithm that implements that if you're a coastal navigating robot. So in these cases, you need to move further away from the goal so as to reduce key uncertainties, so as to make reaching the goal later more likely. And that point about reducing key uncertainties is a place where the predictive processing story gets this on the table. Old example from many years ago, Kirsch and Maglio, expert Tetris players will sometimes rotate one of the Zoids all the way around and then place it. So the rotation was just for Zoid identification. It's not, again, it's achieving the epistemic goal, not the practical one. So there's been a bunch of simulation studies now that show that PP, predictive processing, and active inference agents find epistemic actions of that kind. And the key to that capacity into a lot of stuff that is currently fairly hot in PP world is a minimization of expected future prediction error. So the rest of this talk is all about expected future prediction error. To see how this works, we have to take a little detour through goal-driven action. So here's that little detour. Place where you want to start there is with the idea that a goal or a preference is just a highly expected outcome, sometimes called a target prior. The idea then is that planning and action selection get to aim at those outcomes by making calculations of future prediction error, expected free energy, if you prefer that kind of formulation, under different action plans and policies. Something didn't want to move there. So actions get chosen if they deliver a preferred outcome directly, or else if they probe and sample the environment in a way that brings forth the information that will reduce the uncertainties so that you can solve the problem later. So there's the orangutan here. It's got a nice stick, and it uses it to gauge the depth of the water before it attempts to cross the stream. So importantly, there's no deep or fundamental distinction here between the two types of action. In a sense, they're both happening just because what you're trying to do is harvest predicted outcomes in ways that are conditioned upon your own action selections. So by making an action that reduces future uncertainty relative to a preferred outcome, you're getting closer to your preferred outcome. That means that any PP agent that has a time horizon ought to discover both epistemic and pragmatic actions. There's actually a couple of sort of technical complications here, and I'll mention a paper in a few minutes that tries to unpick some of those. But that's the basic idea, is that if you've got a time horizon, then you should discover both epistemic and practical actions, and you should discover them for pretty much the same reasons. So the crucial move here is this thing about looking at expected future prediction error. Minimizing expected future prediction error implies having a temporally extended generative model, one that lets us choose our actions relative to our goals by taking sequences of actions that include actions that maximize information gain. There's me. So, I think this kind of helps a little bit to understand why turning on the light when we enter a room very seldom strikes us as an epistemic action at all. We sort of feel like it's just part of the sequence of actions that gets us where we want to be. And I think it is. In fact, factoring out the epistemic part of the equation, making the epistemic stuff visible as epistemic stuff, is much harder than simply factoring it in. And that's sort of where this talk will go in the next half. So a lot of simulations have applied this kind of schema, showing that active inference agents seeking to minimize expected free energy will discover epistemic and pragmatic actions and move fluently between the two. There are simulations of active vision by Parr and Friston a couple of times. There's also some simulations of rats navigating their way through mazes that contain rewards. And again, in those cases, you see the rats sometimes taking actions that make their pragmatic situation a bit worse to uncover information that will allow them to resolve the problem better. So the simulated rats do exactly what the human might do. They move in a direction that takes them further from their target to get to a point that bears a known relation to the target. So that's that coastal navigation algorithm. Okay, so the rat stuff works because in a way, the reduction of expected future prediction error is giving you a sort of single currency here, a single way in which the simulated actively inferring rat brain can compare the value of performing an instrumental action now against the value of reducing future uncertainty by means of some epistemic action. So that's a really fundamental thing here. They flow simultaneously, they're not really different, they reflect the same driving imperative to reduce expected prediction error over time. I won't linger on this bit here, but I think this is also pretty much the active inference route to the extended mind. Right. Okay, so the next fundamental bit of the story, before I get to the really speculative stuff, is that these active inference agents also display a useful tendency towards general purpose structure learning. So there's a very, very simple example of this, but one that I think is revealing, and this is why I've been talking to Rosalind Moran such a lot lately about this stuff, comes from some of work that she's done with Cullen et al., comparing very simple reward maximizers with active inference agents as they learn to play a version of Doom, first-person shooter game, where you've got to try and get the monster as it appears. So the reward maximizing agents in their simulations, they're driven simply to get the reward. They rapidly learn a reliable solution, a couple of moves, endlessly repeated. Their performance peaks quite early, they do quite well quite soon, and then it plateaus, they don't do better. The active inference agents took longer to learn about the structure of the arena, if you like, but once they'd done so, then they went on to outperform the reward maximizers, and they did it on the basis of less overall total trials. So there's some of the there's a kind of picture there. You can see the kind of slow start of the active inference agents, but they rapidly overtake the reward maximizers who had found the neat solution fairly early on and applied it again and again. So what seems to be going on there is that there's something about the active inference algorithm which is encouraging exploration. This is sort of actually a little bit different to the way that people often think about these things when they think about dark room problems and so on. So these agents learn that different monster starting locations, which are randomly selected, favor different sequences of actions as the best way to minimize expected future error relative to that preferred outcome, scoring well. So their profile is a bit more like us than it is like a lot of contemporary AI that uses huge data sets. They have a slower start, but they learn richer solutions with less overall training. I think there's something quite interesting going on there. Rosalind Moran, one of the Doom study authors, in a note a day or so ago, put it like this, and I thought it was quite useful just to get this out. Mathematically, if I had two actions that lead to two outcomes, and one action revealed something hidden about the world, while the other revealed something of which I was certain, then under active inference, I'd perform action A only, unless I preferred or had higher utility for the outcome of B. So I think you can see what that, you can see what that means. That means that even very simple agents with time horizons of just a few clock ticks are in a certain sense sort of being natively curious. They'll choose to learn and explore unless there's a high value outcome that they can cache here and now by doing something that they're confident of. That, I think that's an interestingly different perspective. Reducing future uncertainty once expected future prediction error is on the table is always valued. There's really no darkened room trap for them. So I think here there's a sort of nod here to some worries that Mike Wheeler was raising a couple of weeks ago in a PIG session about conservative forms of task-driven problem-solving exploration. Just a nod to that talk, CBGB's in New York provides a kind of new space, if you like, for general-purpose musical structure learning. That will make no sense to anyone that didn't see Mike's PIG talk, but I thought I'd throw it in. So there, of course, is an orangutan doing something that looks a little bit like just general purpose exploration for the sake of it, walking a tightrope. So there's the moral, the fundamental moral, is that PP, I think, shows how and why epistemic actions should arise. And it displays this kind of unity between selecting something epistemic and selecting something practical, because they're just both ways of reducing uncertainty, reducing expected uncertainty relative to preferred outcomes. This is that little sort of caveat that I mentioned earlier. There's some emerging debate about exactly which free energy functional is going to robustly deliver this kind of behavior. So some of my Sussex colleagues, Vera Millage, Millage is in Edinburgh, working with some of my Sussex colleagues, have been looking at this. I don't think that this difference affects today's arguments, but if they're out there, and I can't quite see if they are, we can maybe talk about that in discussion. So, second idea, the next two ideas will come quicker than the first one did. Idea is that in advanced agents, that fundamental merging of pragmatic and epistemic has slowly synergized with something else, with the use of sketches, diagrams, tokens, and material symbols. So I'll give a quick example. Think about the use of a Windex, a wind direction indicator on the sailing boat. The Windex reduces uncertainty about something crucial, wind direction, in my model of successful sailing. It creates a physical sign that makes current wind direction clear and concrete. That's a bit like the orangutan's use of the stick to resolve uncertainty concerning the depth of the water. You can see that general purpose trial and error structure learning might slowly reveal a lot of tricks and ploys like that that get passed on. But in our species, courtesy of some sort of lucky mosaic of small adaptations, historical chance, neural reuse, you know, people tell stories about this kind of stuff. I can help myself to whichever one works out in the end. Something else, something highly flexible, starts to play the role of the Windex or the depth stick. That thing is symbolic culture. We can say the wind is coming from the west, trim the mainsail. We write stuff down, we sketch stuff. We use a host of material codes. I think these have enabled brand new moves in the space within which these agents, ones with temporally deep generative models, can seek to minimize expected future prediction error. And a particularly potent thing that we do there, I think, is that we make aspects of our own generative models into public material objects, words, books, diagrams that we can share, refine, and transmit across generations. This is a nice little diagram of a Scottish country dance, a Paris celebration medley. So that brings me to the last idea. So the last idea and this is, I think, the most speculative of all, is that flexible symbolic material codes let us step back from our own generative models, turning them into public objects that are good not just for sharing, but for questioning, stress testing, and a kind of deliberate breakage. So I think this is probably the most transformative, if you like, epistemic bonus that is conferred by material culture. So think about designing a new sneaker, a new training shoe. The goal is to minimize expected future error in ways that serve the preferred outcome of building a better sneaker. But suppose you can't yet see a clear route to a better sneaker. You might try to reduce your uncertainties by breaking and reforming your generative model. And I think here's someone having a go at that, surrounded by little sort of paper models and sketches and diagrams and probably bits of software. All these things, I think, are letting us independently manipulate different aspects of the design, selectively attend to different elements, explore different outcomes conditioned on different choices, and doing all this in ways that somehow ease the bonds of our internal model-based expectations. I think it's a lot like physically shuffling the Scrabble tiles so that you can discover new words. This is someone coming up with a new kind of pair of scissors. Materializing thoughts in words and scale models lets us, I think, ask what-if questions in this whole new kind of key. What if this thing I currently strongly believe is false? What if that part of the design is replaced with something else? Yeah, what would happen if you tried to hit a baseball pitched at 90% the speed of light? You can do that in the breakout room. So to enable operations like that, my current beliefs need to be more than probabilistic trends in the way I navigate the world on the basis of my stored knowledge. They need to be something like concrete objects, objects apt for attention, sharing, and questioning. Simone de Beauvoir, the body is not a thing, it's a situation, it's our grasp on the world and the outline for our projects. If you couldn't encounter that in that sort of way, it's very hard to see how you could have thoughts about that kind of state. So once they're encountered as objects, then we can use them to help rate the grip of our models, our internal models. And I think this is our kind of epistemic goal. It lets us transcend our own internal model-based limitations. My speculation is that this is exactly how active inference agents who minimize expected future error ought to start to behave in the presence of symbolic culture. So it'd be interesting to see miniature simulations with that kind of structure. Art, I think, is in this sort of model revealing, model breaking business too. It's a way of materializing and confronting some very high level assumptions, high level bits of our generative model of ourselves, the world, and of others. But the cool thing about art is that it reveals these assumptions in a way that lets us step back from our daily concerns. And so we don't really experience it as threatening, even when it's subversive. Science, maybe even more clearly, wants to codify our own best models, delivering them up as objects apt for peer review, sharing, scrutiny. This is all productive breaking. Even maybe Mike Wheeler's twisting the lion's tail from that pig that I mentioned. So there's a little bit of art. There's, it's Goya's old men with soup, and a little bit of science, something broadly relativistic at the bottom there. So finally, there's a very recent development in the PP framework that looks like it ought to stand in some really interesting relation to these potent uses of material culture. It concerns what's called sophisticated inference. It's all highly speculative. It's not published in a peer-reviewed place yet. It's published in one of the archives. I don't really understand it, but I'm just going to mention it and wind up after that. So here's how this bit goes. The idea is that in existing work, expected future prediction error is defined over a space of actions that include actions that improve our own state of information, like rotating the Zoid or using the stick to gauge the depths of the water, and so on. Moving in that space, you exploit epistemic affordances, but there may be a sense in which, maybe like the orangutan, you don't really know about epistemic affordances. What you know about are the consequences of actions, and you know that you can act in ways that will help resolve your own uncertainty. You know that implicitly. But in sophisticated active inference, which is being used as a technical term by Friston and colleagues there, the space the agents can consider includes their own future beliefs. Sophistication, they say, describes the degree to which an agent has beliefs about beliefs. This is kind of overarching topic, I think, of a series of pigs here. So agents like that can choose to act so as to improve their future beliefs, rather than simply to reduce long-term error relative to preferred practical outcomes. You might say, agents like that know the intrinsic value of good belief. Friston et al. Say, we move from simply considering beliefs about what would happen if I did that, to what would I believe about what would happen if I did that. Crucially, this search is over sequences of belief states, as opposed to just states. So in very simple cases, it's really hard to tell these two apart. They can be behaviorally identical. The sophisticated agents only look different when the route to improving information is itself costly, blocked maybe by having to go into a state that you actively don't like, an actively anti-predicted state, something that is in effect punishing. So in the presence of an anti-predicted punishing state that will reveal interest in information, the sophisticated agents kind of push through the pain barrier, as they put it. They take the short-term pain for the long-term gain, while the unsophisticated agents don't and settle for a worse overall strategy. The only other difference is that sophisticated agents are usually more confident when they decide to make an epistemic move. And that's kind of what you'd expect if you sort of know the value of an epistemic move. So I think that there is something interesting going on here, or there will be when it all gets worked out. As if contending with all that expected future prediction error wasn't enough, this is a new can of worms. But the last thing I want to just ask is, which came first, sophisticated inference or symbolic culture? The guess that I just want to put on the table is that it was the accidental discovery for practical purposes of symbolic culture that made the space of our own beliefs visible to us in the first place. So sophisticated inference of this very florid kind might itself be the result of the way basic active inference with time horizons slowly builds us better worlds to think in, delivering lineages of material culture as a kind of means to an end, but does that until thinking itself became visible to the mind. So that's pretty much what I wanted to get on the table, but I just want to run over the structure of that before I quit. So here's the sort of structure as I see it. Once minimizing expected future prediction error gets a foothold, the door to mindful engagement with the world is open. It's not like a reflex. You're looking ahead in time, you're minimizing expected free energy. In some species, deeper time horizons then get to emerge. In others, in some species still, symbolic culture with material symbols gets discovered. The deeper time horizons and the symbolic culture each bootstrap the other forward, until you get to beings like us who can begin to see their own mental and epistemic organization, and then they can try to hack it. And this is the hacking bit that, of course, there won't be really time to do today. But, the use of diagrams in the way to, break the generative model, that's a kind of hacking. Self-directed language can be a kind of hacking. Structured training and meditation practice can be a kind of hacking. The careful use of psychedelic drugs, art, science, culture, and technology, these are all ways in which agents whose thoughts are kind of visible to themselves can take actions that push us outside what look to be the limits of something like prediction and generative model-based ways of going forward. So back to what was supposed to be my last slide. That's the end of the story. Thank you.